These two students were well prepared for the exam to the extent that they were perfectly happy with the three different parts, or four different parts of the test, so they knew the kind of material they were going to be presented with, where they would have to talk on their own and where they would be talking together, and at the beginning, of course, talking to the examiner. And it does seem important that when they come in to a test of this kind, there should be no shocks for them. They should know exactly what they're going to be faced with. For each section of the test, the candidates did follow the instructions. They answered the personal questions in the first part. In the second part, they listened to the task, and their answers were in line with the instructions to a certain extent. They dealt adequately with their own individual pictures and then joined in for a discussion for part 4 at the end of the test. Ottavia dealt well with her photograph, which to some extent was relatively simple because there were two characters there, two people in the picture, and there were small details which she could pick up on, the chips, crisps, and she looked at the windows and she remarked on that. So that was effectively done. Georgia, I think, had maybe a slightly more difficult problem because her photograph was a very busy one indeed. There were so many people, so many computers, and so many details. I think she might have done better. It was difficult, but I think maybe if she had given an overall description of the picture, to say that it was a picture set, for instance, of a very busy office which was full of people, if she had done something like this and then picked up on individual items and people and objects in the picture, she would have found that she could have talked for longer because she in fact didn't quite fill her minute. The candidates interacted fairly well with each other in part 2, although there was not a great deal of discussion. They tended to move from one picture to another. One would talk about the first picture, and then Ottavia talked about the first picture, Georgia talked about the second, and they worked their way through them in this way, whereas I think the task would have been more productive and they would have produced more language and a more interesting discussion if they had dealt with one picture at a time and told each other whether they agreed or not with each other's opinions. And I think if they had done this, they would have been more likely to work towards a conclusion, deciding which would have been best. And it would, of course, have been perfectly acceptable if they had finished up with different ideas about which picture was best. But it doesn't matter which picture they choose, but the important thing is the level of discussion that they manage to inject into their talk. Both candidates performed adequately for this level. Ottavia was slightly stronger of the two. She made few grammar mistakes. She had a reasonable range of vocabulary and her pronunciation was clear. And she did interact effectively with her partner. Georgia's grammar was not quite so secure. She did make one or two errors, not particularly serious ones, but they were there. Her vocabulary was adequate, though she did find herself stumped for some words when she was describing her picture. And perhaps it would have been wiser to say, I'm afraid I don't know the word, or I don't know what to call it. Once she had embarked on pointing to something, she pointed to something in her picture and then realised she didn't know the word and simply left it, went on to something else. Whereas if she had said, I'm afraid I don't know what it's called, she could have gained herself some credit there. Her pronunciation was clear, though she should avoid too many ers in between words when she's simply thinking for the next word, because this becomes quite awkward for the listener. She interacted with her partner reasonably well also. For improving performance in a similar test, I think both candidates need to concentrate on the kind of task that they were presented with in part 2. The idea there is to engage in a discussion. And if you're going to engage in discussion, then obviously you have got to express your own opinions and say very clearly whether you agree or disagree with the opinions of your partner. There are opportunities in a task of this kind to do this, because there are always several pictures to look at and to discuss, and they should not lose sight of the fact that they are attempting to work towards a conclusion, whether or not they agree on that conclusion or not.